Good evening, everybody. My name is Sam Gralty. I'm the events manager with the Vermont Land Trust, and welcome to Growing Together, Vermont's Town Forests as Cultural Landscapes and their role in communities today. Thanks for joining us. If you're not familiar with Vermont Land Trust, we're a membership organization dedicated to protecting farmland, forest land, and community lands across the state. Since 1977, we've permanently protected over 650,000 acres, which equates to roughly 11% of the state. Just a few brief Zoom reminders before we get started. We are recording this, but because it's a webinar, you're not going to appear in the recording. If you have questions for the presenter, like I said, if you could please use the Q&A feature, you should see it at the bottom of your screen. If you see other questions that you like and you want to get answered, you can give those a thumbs up and give them an upvote, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. It'll also help us figure out what follow-up resources we want to send afterwards. I'll also be sending a recording of this if you want to be able to go back and watch anything or share it with others. Additionally, like I said, the chat is open for everybody to chat right now, but we will be turning that off once we start the presentation. If you have any tech issues, though, feel free. You can still chat with me. So if you have any tech issues, feel free to do that. Send me a message, and I'll try my best to help. Additionally, if you want closed captions, those are available at the bottom of your screen as well. But yeah, I think now we will get started, and I'll introduce our panelists. We're going to start with Robert McCullough, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Vermont, who has served as a full-time faculty member of the UVM Historic Preservation Program since 1998. We'll then hear from Cecilia Danks, who's an associate professor at the University of Vermont, whose research focuses on forestry and the intersection of community well-being and forest stewardship. And then finally, we'll hear from Bob Heiser, of Vermont Land Trust Project Director, who works with landowners and communities to protect forest land and community lands in northwestern Vermont. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to Bob McCullough.
Well, thanks, Sam, and welcome, everybody. These introductory images of Montpelier and its Hubbard Park, created in 1901, and today with state-owned land serving as a backdrop to the dome of Vermont's State House, are, I think, a good place to start our discussions for a couple of reasons. The setting offers a glimpse of the long continuing tradition of community-owned woodlands in New England. And by long continuing, I mean a period spanning 4 centuries and traceable to the region's early 17th century nucleated villages, but much, much longer than that if we consider the woodland traditions practiced by indigenous communities. But the view also, I think, provides a backdrop of a different kind, setting the scene for an argument that history is a visual discipline, and that the imprints of that history are writ very clearly and often candidly on the land, whether in our built cultural or natural environments. And by learning to read that history, we can become more engaged with our surroundings, and in turn can make better informed decisions about changes to those environments. And that skill is a valuable one among many needed to confront the challenges of everyday experience. So for purposes of organization, I'll provide a very brief historical context for the region's communal forests, with principal emphasis on town forests as first enabled by state legislation in New England after 1913, and then emphasize the importance of town forests as both cultural and natural landscapes, places where we might conceive ways to span the considerable divide between cultural and natural resource protection practiced in this country, practices that are markedly different from those in many European countries. And then point to the need for more and better protected corridors of connectivity, linking the built cultural and natural environments physically, visually, but also in the mind's eye, as a key step toward achieving a more holistic approach to cultural and natural resource protection. Turning to the historical context of New England's community-owned woodlands, the first point to consider is that an ethic of stewardship has shaped those woodlands throughout that long history. And the threads of that stewardship really begin with the ecologically respectful customs of indigenous communities, a story that is well told by Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. The first European colonists shared a great common weald surrounding 17th century nucleated villages, essential to community purpose. Town proprietors configured individually owned lots around central commons, determined town boundaries, and designated more distant land as common, for example, a common cedar swamp for fence rails. The plan of Sudbury, Massachusetts from 1630 shows the development or the arrangements of these early nucleated villages. But what it doesn't show is that surrounding that settlement center were extensive woodlands that were owned and managed by town proprietors. Unfortunately, most of that great common weald had been transferred to the private sector by 1700, as the map of Walpole, Massachusetts shows. By the time of that map, 1696, only 2 or 3 small parcels of land remained common, and those were all swamps, probably the least valuable land areas at the time. But the map is useful too to show the way that the conveyance of land occurred in a very fractured way, and we'll come back to that point. We'll also come back to the reference to the school farm leasehold in just a minute. The first European colonists also transplanted ancient practices of woodsmanship, embryonic forms of stewardship that culled woodland resources without killing trees, pollarding or lopping trees, cutting limbs at a height to prevent deer from grazing on sprout growth. These are examples of pollard beech trees owned or managed by on Selborne Common, owned or managed by England's National Trust for Places of Historic Interest and Natural Beauty. There's considerable irony here. Let me step back for a second. The reason the National Trust wants to continue managing those traditions of woodsmanship because the unusual shape of the trees created hollows where different ecologies managed to survive, and the goal is to maintain those ecologies. The irony is that Britain's National Trust for Places of Historic Interest and Natural Beauty recognizes the importance of both types of resources. It has been recognizing those resources since 1895. And that irony is accentuated because Octavia Hill, who was a British social reformer, had traveled to America, had studied the charter for the trustees of public reservations in Massachusetts, really the country's first land trust. And that charter had referenced a need to consider both historic and natural resources. She took that idea back to England and used it to create Britain's National Trust. Now, absentee proprietors eventually controlled the founding of new towns throughout the region, and in a few places designated lands to be held in common in perpetuity. And one of the best examples is in Brunswick, Massachusetts. Brunswick Commons, established or created by the Penobscot proprietors, a group of absentee proprietors based in Boston, who assigned 1,000 acres to be held by the town and in common in perpetuity. And over the many decades, encroachments whittled away at that acreage, but by the late 1800s, Brunswick Village Improvement Society had begun to reclaim the land, and assisted by 2 young foresters, Austin Carey and James Toomey, initiated a white pine plantation, which became one of the country's earliest plantations by a town unrelated to watershed protection. Now, although most of the extensive common lands associated with nucleated villages were gone by 1700, early town proprietors, as well as absentee proprietors, continued to set aside public lots. And these were called glebe lots or church lots, minister, parsonage, or school lands. And the purpose was to support those community obligations. And many of these public lots were managed with care, and some that remained in town ownership eventually became town forests. If we refer back to the plan of Walpole, Massachusetts, that school farm leasehold was owned by the town, but rented, and the revenue from the rental used to pay for a schoolmaster or school books. Another really excellent example is shown here. The parsonage lands in Danville, New Hampshire, originally the parish of Hawk. And those parsonage lands were managed by a parsonage committee, which kept very careful records, including timber sale agreements, this one from 1810, that set aside individual trees, each tree with its own price. And the parsonage lands also supplied timber for framing the meeting house in 1760. But then when New Hampshire's Forest Service began promoting town forests after 1913, they turned to Danville as a model example to show how towns could manage woodlands successfully. And the New Hampshire Forest Service prepared the map of the parsonage lands in the right. And the lands are still a town forest and still managed by a parsonage committee. By mid-19th century, town poor farms provided local welfare throughout New England, and many poor farm woodlots eventually became town forests. This is one of the good examples. This is in Groton, Massachusetts, where the town created a memorial forest for World War I veterans. Then after the Civil War, questions about the relationships of deforestation to water supplies, surface collection of water, and even precipitation generated local as well as national concerns, with sharp focus on the availability of water power that had become unreliable for mill town industries. And if knowledge of those relationships remained incomplete at the time, those concerns nevertheless represented eerie harbingers of today's focus on the relationships between forests and carbon footprints in an era of global warming. 150 years later, those discussions from the post-Civil War era are really quite interesting. And by the early 1900s, the emerging forestry professions, schooling, and silviculture advanced forest stewardship significantly in many towns, providing the groundwork for the town forest campaign soon to follow. Now, granted, although that thread of public stewardship traceable throughout the region's history of communal woodlands may have frayed or weakened from time to time, it nevertheless has joined one period of town and forest history to the next, creating a continuum. And that leads to a second point, which is this. If competing visions for these community woodlands, or lack of awareness of their value, continue to present challenges for today's stewards, and they do, we can point to this ancient continuum of woodland stewardship as a tradition worth preserving. And an awareness of that tradition should be part of any conversation about the use or management of these woodlands today. A third point is closely related to the first two. Historical context tells us that New England's town-owned woodlands are cultural as well as natural landscapes, as much a part of urban and village planning history as of forest history. And the cultural imprints of that history, stewardship in its many forms, community welfare, multiple uses of forests, are very visible in these woodlands. And if we look closely too, the history of surveying also finds its way into this cultural context. the boundary work of mappists who knew the land and forests well, and who often made contributions to this thread of stewardship. A really good topic for research. Town forests, which date from 1913 in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, 1915 in Vermont, and later in other parts of New England, occupy special places in the context of cultural imprints on the land and are significant to the region's conservation history. The town forest movement represented the first comprehensive campaign by New England towns to reclaim some of the vast common weald relinquished long ago to the private sector. The movement can also be counted among the country's first broadly structured conservation campaigns of any kind, and certainly the first to encourage public education about proper forest management through local governance. The campaign also promoted scientific forestry practices, sustained yield management at the time, with the goal of reversing profligate clear cutting that dominated the climate sectors. The Town Forest Campaign also disseminated a policy of multiple use forestry. This is really an important part of the history. Recreation in its many different guises, support of wood products industries, reclamation of idle tax forfeited land, wildlife management, ecological study, wood fuel for the public, protection of water quality, aesthetic benefits, memorials to veterans, and even the protection of village centers from sprawling growth. And that list is growing as the imperative of watershed management becomes clear in an era of global warming. The Town Forest this is the Willard H. Jennings Forest in Winchester, New Hampshire. It's a good example that pulls together many of those points. The forest is on Meeting House Hill, a suitable name, and it located directly above the village center, very visible from the community. The land was given to the town by Lucy Jennings Dickinson, the daughter of Willard Jennings, and it was mapped by Dwight Jennings, Lucy Jennings Dickinson's cousin. And in addition, Mrs. Dickinson was married to LaFell Dickinson, who was the president of the New England Boxboard Company, which was very active in that part of New Hampshire. So the relationship to the community center and to wood products industries and to memorial forests is all very clear. But even more, Mrs. Dickinson became head of the National Federation of Women's Clubs in Washington and worked closely with Lyle Watts, the chief U.S. forester, to develop a series of radio programs during World War II, urging towns to create community forests as memorials. The Town Forest Campaign also forged an important alliance between the forestry profession and waterworks engineering. And New England's watershed plantations became some of the most successful examples of forestry management by municipal bodies. This is the Mount Higbee Reservoir owned by Middletown, Connecticut, one of the earliest of the watershed plantations begun with acorns sowed in plowed furrows. And if we think about reading history on the land in terms of layers, the most recent layers partially hiding older periods, watershed areas may be unique in the sense that the history isn't just layered, but it extends outward through the watershed. And in this case, during the Roosevelt administration, the Civil Works Administration developed catch basins higher up in the elevation. And those different periods of cultural imprints become visible in a number of ways, including the architectural designs of the gatehouses. Town forests are also our country's closest ties to German and Swiss communal forests, which represent the places of origin of sustained yield management policies in America during the early 1900s. And for the price of neutrality during the many wars that occupied Germanic countries, during the Middle Ages and later, city-states acquired vast tracts of woodland and began managing those lands to generate predictable annual revenue, an arm of cameral science. The result, even-aged, monocultural coniferous stands harvested and planted in rotation. Gifford Pinchot studied Zurich's city forest, the Silwald, shown here, and as did a number of other American foresters, including Nelson Brown, who assisted the U.S. Forest Service's efforts to create a community forestry program in 1938. And the city forest owned by Fehlingen in southwestern New Jersey, southwestern Germany, on the edge of the Black Forest, was also visited by many American foresters. For me, some of the most inspiring cultural imprints in our town forests are the creative local interpretations of proper woodland management that suggest ways to confront larger challenges faced by forest policymakers. And these are resourceful community models that are nurtured by thoughtful dialogue among sometimes competing forest users. These become the hidden glades of common ground in our backyards. And one such challenge today is the entrenched practice in this country of separating the protection of cultural and natural resources. And I can think of no better places than town forests to have conversations about a more holistic approach to resource protection, one that recognizes a melding of cultural, natural, and built environments. And in town forests, culture and nature are so inextricably entwined that divisions between the two blur to a vanishing point. And that leads to a fourth and final observation. We need more and better protected corridors of connectivity, linking the places of nature, culture, and community. City and wooded park, village and town forest, suburb and wetland preserve, built environment, and wildlife sanctuary. Physical and visual connectivity, but also in the mind's eye as part of everyday experience. This isn't a new idea by any means, but draws from the writing of conservationists and urban planners during the 1920s, who sought to preserve strategically located open spaces and to link them to community centers with footpaths or canoe routes. We need to encourage communities to design travelways for town residents to move comfortably by foot, bicycle, or waterway from central locales to outlying open spaces and to experience a lengthened sense of place, lengthened in time as well as distance, where built cultural and natural environments merge. And in Calais, Vermont, an 11-mile corridor of gravel roads, which happen to be ideal for bicycles, connects the community's 3 town forests with a crossroads village, Kent's Corner, and its landmark 1833 tavern. An 1803 water-powered sawmill is just down the road, too. And during the 1920s, timber harvests from the Bliss Forest, shown in the lower right, generated revenue from the National Clothespin Company in Montpelier, where its factory still stands. Few people know that Montpelier, during the good part of the 20th century, was one of the country's largest manufacturers of wooden clothespins. Now, as we travel through such settings, whether paced by foot or by bicycle, and are struck by an impulse to protect what we have explored, do those impulses originate with the buildings or the forest? What interest is it exactly that triggers such impulses for one or for the other? And if we describe our objectives using the words conservation, preservation, restoration, or reconstruction, are we referring to the forest, or to the buildings? And if in concept those terms are identical, or nearly so, when applied to both forests and buildings, and they are, why do we create such a separation and our efforts to implement those objectives? What is it that keeps us from exploring a more holistic approach to resource protection? And how do we close that divide? So those questions then mark the trail back to our original argument in the beginning of the discussion, that our day-to-day experiences are heightened by our ability to read the history that surrounds us on the land. And if you accept that argument, then it follows that by choosing to read that history comprehensively, free from any nature-culture divide, awareness of our surroundings gains greater depth and, in turn, guides us more clearly in making decisions about how best to value, use, and protect the resources that contribute to habitable living environments, habitable for non-humans and humans. So that's, I think, a good place to pass it on to Bob or Cecilia, and I'll be happy to answer questions through our question period, if that works, Sam.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we'll have Cecilia and Bob present, and we'll save questions for the end. And yeah, I encourage folks to use that Q&A feature. But yeah, I think we will, I'm going to stop you sharing, Bob, and then we'll get Cecilia going.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. And let me. Okay, now will it go into presentation mode? There we go. All right. Thanks. So what I plan to do is share some of the insights from the town forest census. That is a big chunk of it was conducted last year, and we are working away at the rest of it right now as we speak. So I'll talk about the purpose, the process, a few insights, and some next steps. And want to start by acknowledging our primary funder was USDA Forest Service Northeastern States Research Cooperative, and the project coordinator who led the effort until her graduation in December was Julie Frost, who many of you might know. This research team included myself, a colleague Laura Edling, of course, Julie, Elise Shadler from FPR, and a number of undergraduate researchers who helped out. And we were lucky enough to have a large group of advisors, 20 folks. Some of you may be on this call. 2 of you are on the panel that helped guide this effort. And we're all here because town forests are really important. Bob just gave a really elegant description of how they've been important over the decades and centuries. They may be a small part of our landscape. The previous study showed there was about 68,000 acres owned by 168 of our municipalities. But I really feel they have an outsized influence on the health and recreation of our local residents, used for education in sustainable stewardship. I mean, how many of us have heard Ethan Tapper walk us through a town forest talking about what good forestry is in these days? Important in its connectivity, not only to other protected areas, but connectivity through for recreation. And as Bob was describing, connecting, town centers and other natural and cultural areas. And really, town forests are part of a global community. And so I'm glad that Bob brought up those European examples, but here are some from 4 other continents that show how community forests are now sort of at the forefront in conservation, not only protecting this natural cultural resource, but also linking to other protected areas to create landscape level impacts. And there's so we're part of a broader global movement. So the main purpose of the census was to develop a complete set of information that would help agencies, universities, land trusts, others, community members in efforts to improve local capacity, sustainable stewardship, inclusive governance for all new and existing town forests. So big ask. Oops. So I didn't know this was animated here. Yes. So we really were lucky to have a couple things to start with. The Spatial Analysis Lab at UVM back in 2007 did a mapping project where they tried to find all the town forests and figure out if they had management plans. They included that in the protected areas database and updated it in 2015. So we were taking it from there and not only updating that and adding questions. Also in 2021, Julie Evans from the Northern Forest Center did a number of surveys and focus groups trying to get at the governance structures in our town forest. So we had some great efforts to stand on. The way our effort differed a little bit is that we were trying to do a census, meaning we wanted to capture all the towns and all their forests in a replicable way and update some of the growth and usage changes in recent years, which were interesting for different reasons. We really wanted to get perspectives from community stewards themselves. That was the purpose of sending out the census document, whereas the previous studies often relied on key informants, other professionals who sort of knew about what was going on in the state. And then we really saw this not just as a report to finish and produce, but also to share information, that data that we collect, the contacts that we collect, and use as a groundwork for future outreach. Oops, going ahead. So we have a website, we've built a listserv, and that is part of the project. So the process was really a multi-step. We invited the advisory committee. They helped us define the scope. We used the definition. This is not a definition of town forest, but what we were looking at was areas that were owned by local units of government. So that's municipalities and districts that were greater than 5 acres and mostly forested. And this follows the U.S. Forest Service Community Forest Program definition for the most part. They say 75% forested, but that's kind of hard to translate as we're asking people. So we just said mostly forested. And our unit of analysis is the forest, not the municipality. So many municipalities own one or more forest areas that meet this criteria. And then again, with input from the advisory committee and the whole core group, we developed a census. I tried to keep it to just 20 questions, but it ended up to be 22 plus an open-ended one at the end. That covered these topic areas. So general information about the forest itself and the person responding to the census. We were trying to get at the first, well, we'll see that in the next slide, about funding and management governance issues, the management objectives, and then the various uses and challenges that each forest was experiencing, and then some special topics that might change over the time. So we imagine that the first, 1 to 3 categories might be replicable, repeated over time, and then special interest questions might be added. So in this case, we're looking at Indigenous peoples' information, acknowledgement, how that was included, COVID pandemic impacts, interest in carbon markets, things like that. Issues identified by largely the advisory group. So then it was a 2-stage. In order to get the list of who to send the census to, we spent a good chunk of time contacting all of the towns to figure out, so we sent out a little email survey to all 257 municipalities. And luckily we got 58%, a little over half to respond, or 56%, it's on the slide, which yielded about 186 forests. And we asked them who the best contact person was. We sent them the census document, and then about 61% of them responded. So we got about data on 112 forests, and we called that cohort 1. We did sort of best practices and email surveys with multiple reminders to get those numbers. And according to academic literature and our peers, that's a great response rate for email surveys. But it's not a census. So we did not reach every town. And We do see some new strategies for adding those additional forests that require individual outreach town by town, and we'll be employing undergraduate researchers to help with that. But who we're calling cohort 1 is a very interesting group. They looking at how they answered the questions, they answered to the end, that they had a lot of open-ended comments. It was clear that this group had very engaged leadership. And I think while it may not be typical of all the more remote town forests, they are a great group with which to start peer learning efforts. So I don't want to show you all this, the slides. I'll just run through a couple of findings. And we have a summary document that we'll be sharing with the advisory committee soon that has all of the graphs for each, a summary of each question. But looking at who responded, a lot of Conservation Commission members and Conservation Commission chairs and town officials were the key respondents to the survey. Looking historically, most of the forests were more recent, sort of since the 1950s, but we captured some of the ones all the way back to the 1800s that that Bob was mentioning, the sort of different waves of town forest movement. While about 46% added together, 52% were protected, fully protected or partially conserved. Still, there's a large number that are not. And there were some comments about concern for that, that some areas were not fully conserved. In terms of funding to establish a resource, to establish the forest, private donations were really important, but these numbers are the number of forests, not like the percent of funding. So we may have a lot of forests got private donations, but they also relied on town, state, federal, and nonprofit resources to establish a forest. But maintaining the forest, towns relied heavily on town general funds and volunteer labor, which we probably knew, as well as private donations. The study that the SAL did, the mapping project, asked if they had a forest management plan, but our advisory committee said, well, what kind of forest management plan? Because many had multiple plans. So 71 of these 112 had at least one plan. There were comprehensive plans, forestry plans, trail plans, recreation plans, invasive species plans, and only 27 did not have any plans at all. And in terms of what the forests were managed for, recreation, and you can't tell, I know it's really small print, but recreation, forest connectivity and ecological features and educational opportunities were among the top management objectives. This one's hard to read, but it's looking for what the challenges are. And so we asked a number of challenges and how important they were. I won't go through all these, except the top two were ensuring access for all abilities, constructing and maintaining and managing a trail network. I included this because this was one of Bob Heiser's questions. If resources were available and for funding or technical assistance, what topics would you be interested in? And that sort of also sees what the applicants or the people who filled it out saw. And here again, the top three, I'll say, are invasive species management. They would like help with protecting sensitive areas and critical habitat, and monitoring wildlife and environmental impacts. So I'm going to wrap it up here so we can hear from Bob. The next steps that are most important to me are, oops, are they showing it? Are preparing, Julie just graduated last December, finished that summary of results as one of the chapters in her thesis. We have to pull that out and share it with the advisory committee and then more broadly. And again, I would like I'm interested in connecting with others around whether it's a peer gathering or shared learning, so that interpretation of these data are done jointly with communities who might be interested. Oh, and this isn't a can of words, but we asked what town forest means to you, and it's this parcel you're talking about, a town forest. 81 said yes, but and 12 said no. And I think there's a lot to look into about what town forest means, that term. And you know, do we need a new typology? Bob described the typology. Sal, the previous people who worked in Vermont had a typology. It's just something to think about further. So thanks, everybody. We have a website, and there's my email address.
Excellent. Thanks so much. By the way, I'm also definitely going to be sending everybody's contact info to everybody who registered. So if you want to follow up, I'll definitely have that too.
So were you able to stop my sharing, or is it still sharing?
I just did.
Thank you.
There we go. Yep.
Perfect.
And now we'll pass it over to Bob Heiser, who's going to talk about his perspective on town forests.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you are seeing my screen there.
Yep.
Yep. Great.
All good.
Excellent. So again, my name is Bob Heiser, and as Sam said at the outset, I work on conservation projects in the northwestern part of the state. And what I thought I may include here in some brief comments are kind of a handful of examples of how in the recent decades some town forests have been created and how those opportunities arose. And in there also is the conservation of existing town forests and how opportunities to do that arose. And then I'll circle back at the end just with a little bit of overview of what the process tends to look like, some common themes in the creation of community forest and town forest in Vermont. So I will start with just a map here, if I can get this there we go. So this is just a map of town forest projects that Vermont Land Trust has been involved in partnering with local communities on. It's about 60 projects across the state. And just to kind of agree with what Cecilia was saying about the definition of a town forest is not always clear, but this is just municipally owned forests. And there are models such as nonprofit owned forests that often can provide a lot of the values that a town owned forest can provide. And some of the gaps you see in this map in Vermont, there are strong models of nonprofit ownership of forests in some of these areas. But this is just municipally owned forests, and I will be focusing my examples from the northwestern part of the state, which I have the most familiarity with these projects. So, and this represents something like 14,000 acres just in these town forests alone. So it's a way in which a lot of communities have protected a lot of land. So the first example I'll talk about, and I tried to pick a variety of different ways that these opportunities came to be. And so the Moncton Town Forest is the first example, and this is one of the most kind of intentional and proactive efforts that I've been aware of. So Moncton had in its town plan for about a decade exploring and researching and potentially securing a town forest in their community. And so during that decade, the select board appointed a town forest committee even before they had a town forest to research the potential for a town forest in their community. And so they had gatherings and input sessions to get from the community what their vision would be for a town forest in their town. And they researched what other towns did, and then they looked at parcels in their town and thought about what would make potentially a great town forest. And they identified one in particular that had kind of a diversity in the landscape. It had some water features. It had gentle areas right near roads so that people could access it easily and get into the natural world easily, and yet it also had areas of rugged terrain and wildlife habitat. So a really good diversity of values. And they reached out to that landowner and Happily, that landowner was interested in a potential sale of the property for that purpose. So they worked with Vermont Land Trust, and we partnered to get an agreement on that land for the town, and then the town worked through the process of acquiring and conserving that property. Another example where a town committee, or in this case a commission, led the process from the outset was in Georgia. There was a member of the Conservation Commission who was snowshoeing on this property and going up a trail to this remote lake, and was just really struck by the beauty of the property and the thought of what a great resource it was for the public, and that it could be publicly owned and opened up to even more people. And so they approached the landowner, and the landowners were two brothers who lived in Canada, and their parents had purchased this property as a place for a second home that had later burned. And they were thrilled with the idea of this becoming a public resource. And so we worked with them to, again, enable them to acquire and conserve this as a town forest. So those are two examples of really town committees being very proactive and thinking towards what a great town forest could look like. There are other cases such as Westford, where things start with kind of the knowledge that a piece of land that's really important to the community is going to be sold. And in this case, it was a property right across from the local elementary school. So anybody who grew up there or raised their kids there likely drove past this property on a daily basis. And it had this beautiful historic stone wall that ran the length of it, and was a great mix of meadow and forest land. And when it became known that it was for sale, there was a joint meeting called of the Select Board, Planning Commission, Conservation Commission, Trails Committee. I may be forgetting some, but it was very well attended, brought together very quickly. And there were several people who spoke at that meeting who got choked up in talking about kind of how important this land was to the community. And there was also a study that had just been done on this, on ways of solving a septic capacity issue in the town green. And this property is right next to the town center. And one of the meadows was identified as maybe probably the best potential to help solve that problem either now or in the future. So the community had many reasons to think that this was a great opportunity for a town acquisition. So we engaged with negotiations with the landowner, and thankfully we were able to enter into an agreement. And again, the town acquired this and conserved it. So in this case, a threat to a piece of land that was really special became an opportunity. I will say it can be more challenging if land is going on the market or is already on the market to try to launch an acquisition project at that point. But in some cases, it can be done and can be successfully acquired. In some cases, landowners have an existing relationship with a conservation organization like Vermont Land Trust or some other organization. And in this case, the Andrews family in Richmond, we had been talking with them about conservation potential for decades, really. They own 600 acres in an area identified by a whole suite of conservation organizations and local towns as a priority for conservation called the Chittenden County Uplands. And when the land passed from one generation to another, the four siblings, none of them were in the position to own and manage it as farm and forest land, but they wanted to see it maintained as farmland, hopefully, or as forest land, and hopefully open to the public. But they couldn't just give it away, and they came to us for options. And so we worked with them to conserve the farmland first and sell it to a local farm family. And then the 428 acres of forest land, it was not as clear kind of the approach that would be appropriate to take there. It's right on the edge of the village. It is part of this important forest land connectivity area between Camel's Hump State Park and Mount Mansfield State Forest. There are public trails on either side of it. And so we wanted to make sure the local community was aware of the potential opportunity and look for their direction on how and if it should be conserved. And so we had public meetings, we had public site walks, a survey, and in that process, the idea for public ownership as a town forest came to light, and there was a public process and ultimately a town vote where the community of Richmond voted to buy that 428 acres of forest land as a town forest. So this is one of those cases where the landowner kind of had the vision of wanting to see a potential future as farm and forest land for their land, and luckily it worked out. Another similar example is the Peter A. Crush Nature Preserve. In this case, a couple that had previously conserved a portion of their land looked at their property, and it abutted the Cambridge Pines State Forest, which is one of Vermont's few examples of old forest, but had really challenging access for the public to go visit this old forest. And they had a vision to have their property become a public property with a nature trail connecting to the Cambridge Pines State Forest. And they were largely willing to generously donate it to the town, but wanted to see it also conserved. So they knew that that donation of land to the town couldn't later be sold during an economic hardship period or something like that. So we worked with them to raise funds to cover the cost of the conservation, but also to help them build a parking lot, a trail, some bridges to connect the public to this property and to the Cambridge Pines State Forest. We also have worked with a handful of towns that have owned their town forest for a long time, but for any number of reasons wanted to see it conserved. One example of that is the Heinsberg Town Forest. This is a historic and beloved town forest. It's actually on the National Register of Historic Places. And during their almost 100-year existence, there were at least 2 proposals to sell the Heinsberg Town Forest. And luckily, those were voted down, but it kind of brought to the town the realization that it could, in some time of hardship, there could be a decision that changed the direction of this very highly valued town forest. So the Town Forest Committee in particular, as they did harvests on the property, they put away funds to hopefully someday help cover the cost of conservation, because there are legal costs, documentation costs, and also organizations like Vermont Land Trust. If we hold a conservation easement on a property like this, we put money aside so that we always know we're financially able to uphold a conservation easement on a property like this. So as they were doing this, a property, the purple property in that little map inset, 300 acres came up for sale. The original town forest was over 800 acres, had a really popular trail network on it, and a property to the south that connected to another trail network and to another road and access point was going up for sale. And so we partnered with the Heinsberg Land Trust and the Fellowship of the Wheel, a local trail organization, to raise funds to help the town acquire the additional 300 acres, and in doing so also conserve the now larger 1,125 acre town forest. And similarly, even in a case where the town was not looking to add to the town forest, in Jericho, there was a property, Mobbs Farm. This is similarly a beloved property, 233 acres, forest land, open lands, trails, swimming holes, used for a wide variety of uses. And in this case, there had been a history where at times, typically during economically difficult times, there have been some proposals to sell town land, this and other land. And on this property, on a portion of it, there was a solar field put in that made people think about, the direction of this property is not necessarily one of continuing it as a resource for, as kind of a town forest and for all the values that can bring to the community. So there was an interest in conservation of this property, and they went through a public process to see if the townsfolk would be interested in conserving this. Ultimately, there was a vote at town meeting. You can see the bumper sticker that was created down there at the bottom. And it was voted that the community did want to conserve this town forest. So we partnered with the local Jericho Underhill Land Trust, who did some fundraising to help cover the cost, together with the town conservation fund. So they were able to conserve their town forest that they already had owned for quite some time. So in the cases where an acquisition of a new town forest was part of the process, there are some typical steps, starting with typically securing the land with a contract so the community knows exactly what the opportunity is. And then hopefully that contract has some time for the community to do community outreach and education and get input on whether this is an opportunity that the community wants to take on. And if so, then there are typically ecological assessments and legal work for the acquisition. It often involves fundraising and grants, as Cecilia's slide showed on the creation of town forests. It can range from federal to state to local funding options and private donations that it takes to pull some of these projects off. And then the development of a conservation easement that will ensure that the land is publicly owned, open to the public, the key resources on the property are protected, and the community is able to be a part of the management planning process. And then the management planning process in particular is a part that often includes a lot of community input and then deciding within the bounds of the conservation easement what the community wants to see happen on these properties. And so if all goes well, hopefully at the end of all that, there's a acquisition or a conservation of a town forest that the community can benefit from in perpetuity. And that is the end of my slides. Sam, I don't know if you can end my sharing. I don't see the button on my end. There we
I
go.
gotcha.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bob. That was great. Yeah, so now we've got some time for questions and answers. I think I'm going to kick it off with one, actually, which is question the way you were just ending, Bob, about management plans, and curious about like how management plans fit into town forests. Cecilia, from your research, not every town forest had a management plan. I don't know who exactly would make sense to take a stab at responding to this, but can you talk a little bit about how decisions are typically made or could be made on management plans? Because since when you think about it, the whole town is responsible ultimately, but who typically makes those decisions, or how are they typically made?
Do you want to handle that one, Bob or Bob?
I'm happy to jump in, and it varies. And I think, the Heinsberg Town Forest in particular, I think one of the reasons why that is on the National Register of Historic Places has to do with it being, it's not the oldest town forest in New England. It has been around for about 100 years, but one of the things that makes it stand out is that is one of the oldest that has one of the town forest that has had a continuous management plan for a very long time and for a lot of its existence. And I think at the beginning, as I understand the story, it can be one person, the local forester, that is driving that management planning process. I think as town forest has evolved, and certainly with conservation easements on a town forest, there is a requirement that the community have input into a management planning process. And so it really has evolved into a very inclusive process, hopefully, and as I observe in many communities where there's really a lot of outreach to community members to get input onto the various aspects of a town forest plan. Usually as a subset of that, the town may hire or benefit from the county forester's assistance in developing the forest management plan, which is the forestry use of the property.
And that traditionally, that forest management plan by the county forester, it's actually on their to-do list. It's one of their responsibilities is to help communities manage their forests. But as they've described it to me in recent years, it's near the bottom of their to-do list because they also have a lot of work with all the private forest landowners. And the management plans that they've created for communities have often been just about the forestry resource, invasive species, vegetation management. And it's really communities have often wanted a more comprehensive one that includes, the recreation and their trail plan and things like that. Yeah, and as Bob said, for like current funding, often like if the federal community forestry program requires a management plan, one of the comprehensive ones with community input be created.
I might chip in on that question too.
Please.
It would be fun to compare some of the really early management plans with the more recent plans and to see who is involved in developing those plans. For some of the older town forests, it's the county foresters, or in Vermont, the municipal foresters. There were 2 or 3 municipal foresters who worked throughout the state. They were the ones who were working most directly with the towns. And it would be good to compare what was going on in 1935 and what's going on today and how those plans differ and how maybe some of the more recent plans, there are more resources brought to bear on those plans.
Awesome. Thank you. We had a question come in about, I'll just read it. Have town forests been systematically surveyed by Vermont Fish and Wildlife and or Natural Heritage Program staff for rare, threatened, and endangered species? Can any of you speak to that?
Systematically? No. But they're part of a landscape and like local community stewards tend to rely on the sort of regional mapping efforts that Fish and Wildlife and Fish and Game do. So they frequently pull in those data about, the range of, bear and areas where deer, I forget what that's called, where they sleep. Deer.
Bedding?
Deer wintering areas.
Thank you. Deer wintering areas. So they use those maps. But my understanding is they don't systematically look to do inventories in town forests.
From an historical perspective, one of Vermont's county foresters, Wilbur Broder, was very interested in developing management plans for not just town forests, but other forest types to protect wildlife habitat. And some of his plans are really detailed in the way they call for the planting of certain types of vegetation and the protection of places for animals to shelter. Proctor is a good example.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, when a town forest is conserved, often a part of that is an ecological assessment that can offer some additional information for towns. But it's also a great opportunity for kind of local community involvement. There are a lot of examples where local college students or graduate students do special projects on local town forest to do an assessment of the natural communities and any rare communities or species. And the same can be said for local citizens. And if there are, master naturalist programs in the area where it's just a great learning landscape for them to both learn about the local landscape, but also contribute information about what's on those properties.
We had a question come in about basically thinking about landscape level. So are there examples of town forests and management plans working cooperatively with neighboring landowners, especially public land, on landscape level habitat management or silvicultural operations? Anybody know about that working across ownership boundary lines? Has that ever happened or known examples?
I think the Uplands Chittenden project that you were describing, Bob, is this multi-ownership look at landscape scale wildlife habitat in terms of there is some limited, it tends to be silvicultural operations themselves, like harvesting tends to be on an ownership basis for legal reasons in part, who's hiring who, but there have been efforts to coordinate neighboring ones at times. It's kind of ad hoc. It depends on the forester, is my understanding, unless either of you have a better sense.
Cow Mountain Pond in northeastern Vermont is a good example where a group of organizations combined efforts to preserve a large area of land to prevent fracture of forest land. And part of the land is owned by towns. Part of the land, I think, is owned by the state. And I think that there are a number of conservation easements involved too.
Interesting. Let's see. This one I think is for Bob McCullough. So Bob mentioned that early town forests were justified to a mix of purposes: fuel wood, water protection, memorials, etc. Curious if he thinks if we've narrowed our vision too much these days by emphasizing recreation, and if we could benefit from some of that multi-use pragmatism today, and what that might look like.
That's a great question. And I think that historically, the goal was to encourage towns to create town forests by offering the broadest appeal, and that included multiple forest purposes. From an historical perspective, I think anytime a town decides to emphasize multiple forest uses, that would be consistent with the goals of the town forest movement. And that would include timber cultivation and harvesting. Sometimes town forests are set aside as preserves, not to be touched in terms of timber management. And I think that, to a large degree, is inconsistent with the goals of the town forest movement originally. But I'd also say that it's really up to the towns to decide what they want. And as long as people are aware of the historical development of town forests in a broad way, then I think towns should be free to manage those forests in the way that they choose. Calais, again, is a good example. They have 3 town forests. One of them is an ecological preserve. One is managed regularly for timber harvesting, and a third is a backdrop to an old meeting house in what's a place called Gospel Hollow. It's an aesthetic setting as well as productive. And I think timber harvests from the Gospel Hollow town forests have been, the revenue from those harvests has been given to the Conservation Commission. So as an historian, I try to be neutral in terms of what towns, it's not my role to step in and say what towns should do, but I think it's important to be aware of the history and how that history involves multiple use forestry.
Bob or Cecilia, anything to add to that one? Okay. Let's see. Here's an interesting one. Have towns acquired forest lands to develop a municipal or community sugar bush? Has anybody ever heard of that happening?
There is an example, but it's not really a town forest. The old Shaker villages in Canterbury and Sabbath Day Lake owned and managed great areas of common land, and some of those common lands were sugar bush. And yes, it was an interesting part of the Shaker villages.
And I don't know if I can come up with the examples, but I have definitely heard of sugaring operations on community forests. One that comes to mind is the municipally owned Wheeler Nature Park in South Burlington. I know there's been a small sugaring operation there, I think, through UVM students participating in that as well. There's definitely leased sugar bushes on some corners of community forest. And it also just conjures up an example that is, I know, close to you, Sam. But I have seen also orchards planted on town forest, which I think is a great idea that I wonder if it'll start to take hold.
In the data we collected so far, like maple would be a subset of non-timber forest products, and there were only 6 forests suggested they were managing for non-timber forest products. So out of 112, so it's not a survey of all, it's not all the town forest, but it shows it's relatively low. But a great idea.
Yeah, delicious idea. Here's a question about historic structures. Do many or any town forests house historic and cultural features like old structures, foundations, et cetera, that are highlighted as educational venues?
Heinsberg has. It's interesting because when we first started talking to Heinsberg about nominating the forest to the National Register, there were questions about just what was historic and questions about whether the old cellar foundations were what really were historically important. And we tried to steer the discussion toward recognition that these are historic landscapes. But the answer to that, I think, is yes, there are examples of different types of resources that should be recognized and interpreted in town forests. Cellar holes are one example. Those are really archaeological resources. But in the case of the Essex Junction Village Forest, which was one of the early forests in Vermont that was well managed, there was a fire tower. And that's a great example of the type of interesting structure that is a contributing part of a town forest. I think it's also true where there are watershed plantations or where the land is managed for protection of water quality. There's a lot of engineering associated with those settings, and those are important historically. I don't know, maybe Cecilia and Bob, you might want to chip in on that one too.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a town forest without a cellar hole, but whether to the extent to which they feature that or not really varies. In our survey, about 23 out of the 112 highlighted preservation of cultural heritage and history as a management objective. So not that it's just there, but they're actually managing for that.
Yeah, and cellar holes jump to my mind as well, but I'll also mention them in Moncton. They, have only owned their town forest for a year, but there was a kaolin clay operation on that property. Kaolin used for some ingredients in making porcelain or pottery, essentially, and also makeup at the time and paper filling. And so it's very much on their plan to have, point to the history there and include it in their local cultural history.
It's a great opportunity for interpretation to add public appeal to these forests.
Definitely. Well, we are at time, unfortunately, so I think we will have to wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us. Panelists and viewers as well. We really appreciate you coming. Quick note, we do have some more VLT events coming up. I'll highlight a couple webinars since we're spread all over the place. We do have a wildflower webinar with ecologist Liz Thompson coming up on March 30th. And we have a webinar on April 8th, which is a virtual tour across 3 different landscapes down in southeastern Vermont, highlighting some partners that we work with down in that area. So keep an eye out for those. If you go to vlt.org/events, you can see all of our events there. I will be sending a follow-up email with a recording of this. It'll take a day or 2 to get that processed, but I'll send that as well as some follow-up resources and contact information. But other than that, I think everybody, thank you for coming and have a wonderful night.